Sunday for me. Well, actually, I've been to this congregation, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, I guess. I usually come with Yo when I'm in the islands here. Anyway, a couple of Sunday morning Sunday school lessons, and it's been a delight to be with you. It's almost Christmas, so I'm sure you're trying to get all of your last stuff done, whatever that last stuff is. In a way, I guess I'm exempt this year because I'm away from my home until just before Christmas, so all that stuff that has to be done, my wife has to do it. So she keeps texting me, telling me what's next on the list. I keep telling her, go, 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 go.
We all need a cheerleader.
That's right. Well, that's it's worth something anyway. I'm afraid, though, the week after Christmas there will be a list for me.
Sometimes the cleanup is the worst.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. In fact, if I do the cleanup, my wife's usually pretty happy with that. Put the dishes away, clean up all the stuff, you know. We're doing this little study, well, the longer study is actually through the Bible, the whole Bible, but last week and this week we're doing this little survey of the book of Judges, which is one of the books that is maybe not quite as well known as some others in the Old Testament. There's a few stories in Judges that are more familiar to most people. Most people know who Samson is, and they may know something about Deborah, maybe Gideon, because some of those become Sunday school stories. They're pretty easily adaptable for children. But then there's other parts of this book that are almost unknown to most Christians until they read it the first time and they think, whoa, that's in the Bible? Wow, I didn't know that. Because there's some really unusual stories here. So last week we did some introductory work. We talked a little bit about when Judges was possibly written, and the fact that the book is essentially a book about covenant failure. It's about the failure of the Israelites to maintain their faithfulness to the Lord after they got into the land. And even though they were supposed to complete what Joshua began, they were very unsuccessful in trying to make that completion. They were facing technological disadvantages. They were probably facing some numerical disadvantages. That's, I guess, a little bit less clear. But in any case, they weren't trusting in the Lord. And in not trusting the Lord, they ended up compromising their own faith. They lived among the Canaanites. They began to adopt practices of the Canaanites, the worldview of the Canaanites, and so it was kind of a back and forth thing. So the book of Judges goes through several cycles, at least 6 major cycles in which they sort of flagrantly break covenant. Then they are in oppression from the Canaanites. Then because they're in oppression, they're crying out for help. Oh, Lord, do something for us. And the Lord sends them a deliverer, a judge, and then he rescues them from their oppressors, and then they go through a period of some relative stability and peace, and then they fall back into the same cycle. So it kind of goes around the same stump a number of times. So we got up through the stump, if you will, of Deborah last week, and we're going to pick up with a guy by the name of Gideon in this week. So that's where we are and where we're going. Let me see, there's one other thing I want to do here while I'm thinking of it, and that's put this in so I can just click this thing. All right. Whoops. I do actually need to go ahead to where the lesson is, I guess, don't I? Let me do that first. Thought I already did that. Sorry. So if you're looking at your handout, I'm starting up in the middle of that handout in what is actually about slide 24 or 5, something like that. I use this little bas-relief on my title slide because it is one of the very few bas-reliefs that actually show someone blowing a shofar. And that's something that actually happens in the story of Gideon. We actually do have the blowing of the shofar. So we're going to start with Gideon of Manasseh, which is about a 3-chapter section in the book of Judges. Earlier, we talked about the technological advantage of chariotry versus infantry in the lowlands. One of the things that the Canaanites seemed to be quite proficient at is that they had chariotry. They were generally running the 2-horse chariot in Canaan. The Egyptians had a 3-horse chariot, and eventually you'll have the Assyrians that'll have a 4-horsepower chariot. I don't know if that's where we get the word horsepower from, but horses were primarily used for chariotry. They were not used for cavalry, for instance, at this period of time. So you don't have horsemen in the way that we think about cavalry, but you do have chariotry. And so if chariots gave this edge to the Canaanites in the coastal areas, on the other side of Israel, they had to contend with marauders who were on camels. Now, anybody ever ridden a camel? Okay, yeah, one. They're quite ugly, stinky beasts. That's just not any other way to say it. You get on a camel, he gets kind of down on his knees, you get up on the hump, and then he gets up. But oddly enough, camels are pretty fast. You don't think about a camel as a runner, but a camel can run about the same speed as a horse. And so the ancient version of cavalry, if you want to call it that, would be camel cavalry rather than horse cavalry. And so from the eastern side of the Jordan River, there were marauders, particularly the desert-dwelling Midianites, who used camels as their primary war vehicles, if you will. And they had begun raiding across the Jordan River, and the people of Manasseh, which is, you remember Manasseh is split into 2 pieces. They're not quite contiguous. There's one on the east side of Jordan, one on the west side of Jordan. So the Midianites are doing camel raids, and it's sort of like, I've called it tax collecting expeditions. I don't know that it was really taxes, no government, but they're picking up stuff, okay? And the Israelites seem to be unable to defend themselves, and in fact in chapter 6 and verse 2, it says that the Israelites sheltered themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. So they're basically hiding out. The Midianites would come in and steal the crops, and one of the places where they would steal crops is at threshing floors. A threshing floor is where they winnow the grain. I don't know if those terms are familiar to you, but by winnowing, you take the shocks of wheat and you actually roll over them with kind of a sledge of some sort to loosen the grain from the stalk, and then someone with what looks like an ancient version of a pitchfork throws it up in the air so that the chaff blows away. And usually a threshing floor is on some kind of a higher escarpment like a hill or some place where you get a little breeze. So you throw this up and the chaff blows away and the grain falls down, and you'd keep doing that until you basically get rid of most of the chaff, and then you sieve the rest of it to get the chaff out of the grain before it's actually ground into flour. So when you have a threshing floor and you've already harvested the crop, you've got the grain in, and you're waiting to put it into storage in either grain pits or whatever kind of storage vehicle you have, sometimes in jars. That's when the raiders would come. I mean, they don't want to farm. They want you to do all that work for them. They want to wait till it's basically done, and then they'll come in and take it. So the Israelites are having real problems with this. Is the reason in the little book of Ruth. Have you done Ruth yet? No. Well, it's about this time. The book of Ruth is written in the time of the Judges. Okay, I mean, it's the storyline happens in the time of the Judges, and in part of the story, Boaz goes and sleeps by the grain pile on the threshing floor. Now, he's there basically as a guard. He wants to make sure that nobody comes in the night or whatever and steals this stuff. So this is happening for the Israelites, and the Israelites are very oppressed. They're crying out to God for help, and basically God sends them 2 things. First of all, he sends them a message from a prophet that says, your oppression is basically the result of your unfaithfulness to the covenant. This is part of the curses from the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy says if you're obedient, you'll be blessed. If you break covenant, you'll be disciplined. And so these are disciplines because you've broken covenant. But then also God responds with the call of Gideon to be their leader. Now, I'm going to not really spend much time with most of chapter 6 in Judges. This is the call of Gideon. The angel calls him, and he's a little reluctant at first. He says he wants a sign. In fact, we find that a couple places here. He seems to be kind of a reluctant leader. But in any case, in the end of the story, he does agree to follow the call of God. And he's going to be the deliverer for Israel. And so all of these people are going to join in him for his war against the Midianites. About 30,000. And the first thing God tells him is, we got too many soldiers. That just sounds odd, doesn't it? We got too many. Usually you don't have enough. We got too many volunteers. Have you ever been in a church that had too many volunteers? I mean, you have?
Not yet.
No, you said not yet. Yeah, I was going to say, wow. That'd be the first one that I know about. Usually you want a few more. But in this case, they got too many. And so what does the Lord say to Gideon to do?
Get rid of it.
Yeah. He says, anybody that's afraid, go home. 2/3 of them left. That's the reason you don't say stuff like that to volunteers in your church. You know, if you don't really want to do this, you can go home. Whoosh, off they go. He gets rid of a whole bunch of them, and then he said, you still got too many. Now, this is just fascinating. So he says, take them down to the river, have them drink, and everybody that scoops up water and laps the water kind of like a dog would do is in one camp, and all of those who just bend down and suck it out of the creek, they're the other guys. All those send all those home, and most of them did it that way. So they went home. He ends up with just what's he end up with, 300?
300.
He starts with thousands and thousands, and he ends up with this little group. And so he reduces the force, but he arms them with shofars and empty clay jars with lamps in them. Now, a lamp in the ancient world looks, I think, is this word? Yeah. And a lamp looks something like this in the ancient world. It's just basically a clay vessel with pinches on the sides, and these would hold wicks. The middle part's filled with oil. Sometimes they had a covering so that you have a hole here so it doesn't spill out very easily. But anyway, you can have, I've seen as many as 7 or 8 wicks in the same lamp, or a 4-wick lamp. It's kind of like Watson the bulb, you know. You got a 4-wicker or a 2-wicker, how much light you want. But anyway, they have these clay jars, and inside the clay jars they have lamps that are lit, but of course since they're inside the jar they can't be seen. And then they have shofars, and they're going to attack this enemy with just that. And in the night they break the jars so that suddenly the light flares out, and they blow on the shofars and sound a war cry. Now, typically in the ancient world, the shofar is a battle instrument. At least that's one of its major uses. And the blowing of a shofar often would control about 1,000 soldiers. So if the 300 all are blowing shofars at once in the dark, where nobody can see them, it sounds like, whoa, it sounds like a huge army, even though it's only 300. And so the Midianites, all 300 blasting at once, sound like a huge, huge army. And the Midianites, they panic, and they're going to run. So this is an ancient shofar. Now, this actual shofar is actually Hittite, not Israelite, but I don't actually have an Israelite carving from as old as this time. But there's a shofar, a more modern-looking kind of shofar that sometimes you see used in Jewish circles, and you can actually buy them. There's a website run by Jewish people that's their specialty. They sell shofars. So if you want to get you one, you can go online and get one for, well, it's kind of late to get one for Christmas, I guess, but maybe next Christmas you can get a shofar. Might take you a little technique to learn how to blow the thing, you know, it's, you got to get your lips just right and so on, but they're a very distinctive sound, a very loud sound. I know in Jewish Messianic circles, they use them. I have two Messianic rabbi friends of mine in the Detroit area that I have breakfast with about once a month, you know, and so they're on their high holy days, you know, like Yom Kippur and Passover and so on, there will be some ceremonies where they blow the shofar.
How does that compare with blowing the conch shell and the sound?
Well, it's a much more shrill sound than a conch shell, at least from what I've heard, and it's quite a bit louder. I'm not an expert in wind instruments, so I don't know what to say other than that. A conch shell, my impression, now you know more about conch shells than I do, because you live where you can probably find them, but my impression is those are a little softer, mellower sound, is that right?
Depends on how big they are.
Oh, okay.
And who is blowing them.
And who, okay.
Yeah.
So some of it's technique and,
Right.
yeah, okay.
And getting the lips just right.
Yeah.
And all.
That would make sense, yeah. Well, I guess I don't know how to make that comparison. I have heard a shofar, and I have heard a conch shell, but not much, so I'll beg ignorance on that. Now, once Gideon and his men head after these guys, they finally rout them, and then the Ephraimites are called to take over one of the fords in the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan River has very steep banks. It's not a really big river, but it's a difficult river to cross because the embankments are very steep. And there's only about 3 good places to ford the Jordan River. And the middle ford is what we're talking about in Judges 7. And the Ephraimites take over the middle ford of the Jordan River, and in doing so, they manage to capture 2 of the Midianite leaders, Orav and Zeev. And they killed them both, and they decapitated them and brought their heads to Gideon. Now that sounds pretty grisly, cutting off somebody's head and then carrying it somewhere. But that was not unusual in the ancient world. And I have a little bas-relief here that shows Assyrians, and these guys are not carrying buckets, they're carrying heads. And this is a pile of heads. You've heard of the term head count? This is a serious head count. Okay. You actually have a story in the book of 2 Kings where Jehu, the king of the north, decapitates about 70 and piles their heads, kind of like this piles them outside the city gate. So it's sort of a horrific kind of idea. We also know that happens in one very famous story in the Old Testament in which the head of a Philistine is decapitated, and that's in the story of David and Goliath. But this was part of the ancient sort of procedures for war and enemies. So now, you have read the book of Judges, and one of the things that happens in this reluctance of Gideon is that he does this thing with a sheepskin. Remember this story? Do you read that story? He says, well, now, if you really want me to do this, I want the sheepskin to be dry and the ground around it with dew, and then he reverses it. I want the sheepskin to have dew and the ground dry. What do you think about that? Should you do that sort of thing? As a believer in the Lord, should you, I don't know, sort of test God with certain things? Say, oh God, if you really want me to do something, I want you to do this first. What do you think about that?
We have a way to do that today.
Okay.
Just in terms of if we feel that God is calling us to do something, we look to Scripture to make sure it's consistent.
Okay. Yeah. Gideon really didn't have his own text of the Bible. I mean, he may have heard it read at the festivals, but it wasn't like he could go have some quiet time in the mountain and look up a passage. That's maybe worth thinking about. Someone else?
In our humanness, we want to bargain with God where we're not supposed to. We're supposed to
Yeah.
honor Him unequivocally and
Sure.
trust in Him.
There's another passage that says, do not put the Lord your God to the test. So I guess my own thinking on this is that putting out sheepskins, so to speak, you need to be a little careful about that. I think testing by Scripture is a little bit different than this sort of thing. I would be all for making sure that what you think God wants you to do is in alignment with the Bible. On the other hand, I think I would be pretty cautious about asking God to produce signs in order for me to know what to do. For one thing, Jesus said, it is a wicked and adulterous generation that seeks a sign. He doesn't seem to think maybe this is the way to go. Anyway, I thought I'd ask the question, though, because you do find Christians that think that maybe you should do that, and sometimes they call that fleecing the Lord, which is a horrible expression. I hate that expression, but anyway. That's like leaders fleecing the congregation, but that means something altogether different. That usually means something dishonest. But anyway, it's a question that Christians have asked. Why do you think God so drastically reduced the size of Gideon's army?
So that they could not take the credit for, in terms of overwhelming numbers for defeating the enemy, that it was God's majesty that defeated them. Leadership.
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, it kind of actually says that in the text. In chapter 7 and verse 2, for instance, Yahweh said to Gideon, you have too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me that her own strength has saved her. Announce to the people, anyone who is afraid, go home. So it actually says this reduction is so that they won't think of themselves as being militarily strong, but that they will think of themselves as trusting in the Lord who has helped them in this thing. And maybe that's a good thing to remember every time you feel like you're up against overwhelming odds. Because we often feel that way as Christians. We face circumstances, we face things in life that you think, boy, I'm not up for this. But where you're not up for it, God is. God is your very present help in time of trouble. His strength is sufficient. All right. Now we move to another cycle. This was the one with Jephthah. And I'm skipping the little part about Avimelech. This was one of Jephthah's sons who actually tried to become a king, kind of a maverick king, and it didn't go very well. In the end, he gets banged on the head by a woman who threw a millstone over the wall, cracked his skull. So he didn't last too long. But we won't really spend much time with that. But I'm going to go ahead to chapter 11, which is the Jephthah of Gad. Now, Gad is a Transjordan tribe. It's in the east side of the Jordan River. And it begins again with a description of Israel's lapse into pagan worship. And as is typical, the people cry out for help. And isn't that pretty human? Don't we do that? We get ourselves in a bind and say, okay, I'm in trouble now, Lord. I need your help. It's pretty easy to do that as a human being. So there's this sort of sarcastic response. Why don't you go cry out to the God you've chosen? Which is really a sarcasm. They've been dabbling with other gods. So God says, why don't you go talk to them if you want some help? Why you talk to me? Now, I don't know how God said this to them. It doesn't actually say a prophet came. It just says God said this to them, but I'm suspecting that maybe it came through the voice of a prophet. It doesn't mention a prophet specifically. But anyway, when they finally did actually demonstrate repentance, and they got rid of their paganism and all that kind of stuff. Then the Lord did respond to them through a man by the name of Jephthah, who was from Gilead, and Gilead is in the territory of Gad. Now, at various times in the Old Testament, you'll find references to Gilead. Gilead is not a tribe. Gilead is a region. Gad is a tribe. But Gilead is a region within Gad. Does that make sense? It's a region within the assigned or allotted territory to the tribe of Gad. Mostly we only think about Gilead when we hear about the balm of Gilead or something like that. You know, you hear different kinds of phrases like that. So anyway, he's from that area, and he is going to lead Israel against Ammon. Now, Ammon is also a Transjordan nation. Ammon is a bit further east than Gilead, so it would be kind of like the next big geographical area to the east of Gilead. And so Jephthah, in his war against the Ammonites, is going to make a very unusual vow, and I'd like us to read it together, and it is in chapter 11. So, once you get into chapter 11, let me see here, where am I at here? Now I've lost my place here. Oh, here it is. Chapter 11 and verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead, and Manasseh passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to Yahweh. What is a vow? It's a promise. It's a solemn promise. So a vow is maybe a little bit more than just a kind of a casual promise. This is a real serious promise. So he makes a vow. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be Yahweh's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. So Jephthah makes this vow to God. Whatever comes out my doorway, I'll sacrifice it to you. Now, we're going to go a little bit into, in a moment, into an Israelite home and what an Israelite house looks like. So he would offer this as a burnt offering. This is where we get the word Holocaust from. The word Holocaust comes from the Hebrew word for burnt offering, which means the Allah. Holocaust comes from the Hebrew term Allah, which means the holah is what goes up in smoke as it's burnt. And so the Jews are the ones who actually coined the term Holocaust out of the World War II debacle, because they felt like as a people group they were being given up kind of like a burnt offering in the anti-Semitism of the Third Reich and that sort of thing. But the term Holocaust really goes back to this Hebrew word for burnt offering. And so he says he will give whatever comes out of his house, whatever that is, will be as a holocaust unto God if God gives him the victory. Now, whether he envisioned this to be a person or not is not clear, because the Israelite 4-room house contained animals as well as people. So the Hebrew text of Jephthah's vow simply says this: the comer forth who comes forth. Now that's syntactically impossible English, I understand that. But that's fairly typical Hebrew. The comer forth comes forth, whatever that is. Anybody ever been in Europe and seen the sort of the old traditional houses and cow barns that are kind of one building? They have a wall between the barn part and the house part. I think that, I'm assuming, is to prevent more loss of heat. So animals have a little bit of warmth anyway, and humans. And so anyway, I know I've seen them many times in Germany where you have these houses, and if you didn't actually know one end of it was a barn, by looking in the door and seeing, oh, there's cows in there, you'd think it was part of a really big house. But there's a dividing thing. Is that true in Holland maybe as well?
Probably.
I would guess. I don't know. But I've seen it a number of times in Germany anyway. The Israelites had a particular style of building a house, and I want to talk about it in a moment. In fact, it is so typical of the Israelites that archaeologists call this the 4-room house. Now, it didn't always have just 4 rooms, but it basically had 4 major spaces in it. And this is so typical of the Israelites that this is one way in which when archaeologists are uncovering an ancient like village or something, they can tell whether it is Israelite or Canaanite. Because the Canaanites did not use 4-room houses, but the Israelites did. And the Israelites almost always did. And so this is sometimes by archaeologists called the Israelite house or the 4-room house. It's not always easy when you dig things up to figure out who this stuff belongs to, because their cultures are not hugely different. And they use, even though they have different languages, they use the same alphabet, and many of their words are common between them. So, for instance, Hebrew, Edomitish, Moabitish, Ugaritic, all of these have the same alphabet and a lot of the same words. So when you discover something, unless somebody wrote a sign says, by the way, this belonged to so-and-so the Israelite, you're not always sure whether it is an Israelite. But if it is a 4-room house, that is almost always a real telltale indicator. Now, here's the 4-room house. This is an excavation of one 4-room house, and you'll see it's divided into 4 basic areas. There's a long area at the back, which actually could be divided, and there's a central courtyard, and then there are 2 spaces on the sides. And these are the living quarters of both people and their animals. And their animals usually would be goats, sheep, cows. In fact, in the Hebrew, they divide animals into basically 2 groups. Big goats and little goats. And big goats are cows. Little goats are what we call goats. Okay, they just kind of have these two words. Anyway, sometimes one side of this would be for animals, the rest would be for people. Now, archaeologists and scholars have often wondered why and how did they develop this style, and what was the purpose of this style? They've kind of come to a conclusion on that. Now, I don't know we can say this absolutely for sure, but it's pretty much a consensus now among scholars and archaeologists that the way this house was set up was especially in the interest of Israelite purity laws. Now, what kind of things can happen to you to make you impure, or as the old word is, unclean? Which means basically you can't go to the temple and you can't do certain kinds of religious things. What makes you defiled?
Eating the wrong food.
Eating the wrong kind of food. So non-kosher kind of stuff.
Touching dead animals.
Touching dead anything. Even your uncle. If you have to prepare your uncle for burial, for instance, you will be unclean for 7 days. And you have to go through rituals before you are then, quote unquote, purified. Furthermore, in uncleanness is transferred by secondary contact. That means not only am I defiled if I touch a dead body, anyone who touches anything that belongs to me is also defiled because I've touched a dead body. So that's defilement by secondary contact. Okay? So, if I have a clay vessel, and something is like a dead fly in my vessel, which renders this unclean, what do I have to do with this? Throw it out, destroy it. You can't just wash it. You have to get rid of it. This is the reason every village had a potter's field, which is basically for crushed, used pottery that you can't use anymore. Now, that didn't apply to stoneware. For whatever reason, stoneware was able to be washed and reused, but pottery couldn't. Anyway, with secondary contact, you have all kinds of small issues that are described in the book of Leviticus that would render you unclean. And if you have a house set up like this, you can quarantine members of the household from the other members of the household so that they don't transfer their uncleanness by secondary contact. Let us suppose you were part of a funeral thing with some relative, and so for 7 days you can live in this side of the house. People can pass through here and go to this side of the house, but you don't touch anything that's on this side. And so generally they think that's how the four-room house worked. It was basically a way of sectioning off parts of the family. It could be because they were dealing with something that had to do with blood. Blood was a defilant, contaminant, a number of kinds of things. In any case, because this has both humans and animals in it, we kind of assume that Jephthah is thinking that the first thing coming across his house threshold might be like a goat or something like that. As it turns out, what was it? His daughter. Wow, well that really changes things. So, by the way, this is kind of what the house would look like if it had a second story, because a lot of them did have second stories. But you can see the animals are over here in this side, and then there's this courtyard part, and then there's another part over here, and then there's a part in the back. So what did Jephthah do? There are two side-by-side statements, and we need to read them both. When his daughter came out of the door, and she was his only child, he immediately tears his clothes and says, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched, because I've made a vow to the Lord I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies. But grant me this one request. Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "And you may go," he said, and she let her go for 2 months. But after the 2 months, verse 39, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed. And she was a virgin. Now, there's these two statements side by side. He did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. What does that mean? People have struggled with this not only for centuries, but for millennia. The Jews struggle with this passage, and it comes up in the Talmud, in the Mishnah. What did Jephthah do? If he offered her as a human sacrifice, which at least at first sounds like what he said he was going to do, why doesn't the Bible condemn him? The Bible everywhere condemns things like human sacrifice. If, on the other hand, he made her into a living sacrifice of perpetual virginity without marriage, how could it be said that he had fulfilled his vow? That's not what he said he was going to do. He said he was going to offer her as a Holocaust. When we come to Jewish kinds of things, Josephus, this is a historian about the time of Jesus, actually says he offered her as a sacrifice. He burned her. And the rabbis in the Talmud, which is later than Josephus, said the same thing. Jephthah offered her as a burnt offering. But many Christians, especially in light of Hebrews 11:32, which talks about Jephthah as a hero, okay, he's listed in a listing of Old Testament heroes of faith, they seem to be pretty uncomfortable with the idea that Jephthah murdered his own daughter. And this is something that has never been clearly understood one way or another. So, I don't know, what do you think about it? We're not going to come to any firm conclusion this morning because no one ever has yet. But I still think it's worth exploring what you think. Do you have any ideas here? One way or another? What would you do if it was you? Well, boy, am I glad I only have boys. Actually, I have a granddaughter.
Would you kill your son?
I just can't see how I could possibly do it.
I mean,
it's just
I think it was a ridiculous vow, because why would he
Yeah.
or a dog's going to come running out? I would think maybe his wife or a child would come out to greet him.
You'd think he would at least consider that as a possibility. Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, this is why we often call this Jephthah's rash vow. It's a vow without real careful thinking through.
Well, yeah, without real thinking through, but however, I think he was so committed to God that he was going to honor God in whatever situation it would happen to occur. Whether it be his daughter, his animal, or whatever. He was really devoted and dedicated to God.
In some ways, it's similar.
I mean, it wouldn't be easy, no.
No.
To sacrifice your own daughter or son.
But in some ways, it's similar to Abraham taking Isaac when God says, sacrifice your son.
Take his own son to die for us.
And Abraham was going to do it. I mean, the knife was in his hand over his head. I mean, it was the last possible moment when God said, wait. Abraham! Thank God you called for me from the bush there. So it's a really hard thing. But I think it does bring us back to the idea, even however we think about this, whatever we think he did or didn't do, it certainly brings us back to the idea that vows are serious. And when you make one before God, you need to be very careful about how you do that. In the book of Ecclesiastes, for instance, there is a passage that talks about being very careful about making vows because God expects you to follow through on those. And in this case, it's a really heart-wrenching story that we wish we actually knew what happened, and we don't for sure. Let's see. I want to go. No, not there. I'm sorry. I went the wrong way. What am I doing here? Turn to Ecclesiastes 5. This is this passage I mentioned, and we're going to look at it real quickly. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It's better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and don't protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. So this verse really says vows are pretty serious things. You'll find the references to vows a number of times in the Psalms, where near the end of the psalm it will say something like, and I will fulfill my vow to the Lord, whatever that vow was. Do you find any Christians who make vows in the New Testament?
Marriage vows.
Pardon me?
Marriage vows.
Marriage vows, okay. I don't know if we have any examples in the New Testament, but we certainly have marriages in the New Testament. So when you make a marriage vow, how serious is that?
Not too serious these days.
Well, maybe I asked that incorrectly. How serious do you think it ought to be?
Forever.
It should be pretty serious, right? Yeah, I do realize that people don't think about that today, but I think your vows are the critical part of the whole thing, because you're promising before God that you will be faithful. Any other examples? There's this one really good example in the New Testament of someone who made a vow.
Well, there were some that vowed they weren't going to eat until something came to pass.
Well, there were some that was in the book of Acts. They vowed that they wouldn't eat until they killed Paul. I don't know if they starved to death, because they never did kill him. The centurion took him off to Caesarea, and they went a long time without eating. The one I'm thinking of is Paul himself, who took a Nazirite vow in Cenchrea, which meant that he shaved his head. You shave your head at the beginning of the vow, and then you let your hair grow during the time of the vow, however long the vow is. And then you go to the temple and you shave your head a second time and offer your hair along with some sacrifices at the temple. There's a ritual for that, for the Nazirite vow. And so Paul apparently took a Nazirite vow for a period of time, about probably in the neighborhood of a year and a half or so. It was a substantial amount of time. He took the vow near the end of his second missionary journey, and doesn't fulfill it until the end of his third missionary journey. So it's a fairly lengthy one. I guess that's all I'll say about that. Well, let's go to Samson. We've only got another 13, 14 minutes, so no, not that much even, maybe. Yeah, maybe 13. Samson, who's the last of the judges in the book, sort of epitomizes the Israelites, both being empowered by God, rescued by God, but also very terrible failure. And Samson is very much a bigger-than-life kind of character. Did you see what was that? I don't know, a couple years ago they had the movie on the Bible where they went through the Bible, Genesis, and all the way through. Do you remember the Samson one? Samson was a really big African-American guy, looked like about a 300-pound guy. You didn't see that? Okay, well, a couple of you did anyway. It was really interesting. They had, when they had the angels at Sodom, they were ninja guys, you know. It was kind of a little bit over the top in a place or two, but it was interesting at least. Anyway, Samson is kind of a bigger-than-life person, and he has a Nazirite vow for life, which means his hair was never to be cut. He was never to drink wine. He was never to touch a corpse, even the corpses of his own parents. When his parents died, which they didn't actually describe that in this book, but if they died, someone else would have had to take care of their bodies. So these were all part of a Nazirite vow, and with that comes, in this case at least, superhuman strength. But Samson begins to show his carelessness about his vow pretty early in the story. And so he kind of epitomizes the whole nation. How does he, first of all, violate his vow? What is his first big violation?
He takes a life out of this from not in his plan.
Yeah, he does that. And she, of course, is a non-Israelite. She's a Philistine. And when he's headed down there, he encounters a lion. Now, lions, the Asian lion, actually, they lasted in Asia until, I think the last that were actually seen in Asia were in the 1700s. So the Asian lion lasted a long time in this part of the world, longer than we would have thought. The Asian lion is a little bit smaller than the African lion, but looks a lot like an African lion. The males have a big mane, and they're a very powerful cat. They were probably the most ferocious wild animal in the ancient Near East. The Assyrians actually used them for sport. They collected lions, and then only the emperor was allowed to kill them because these were sort of his private domain. But in any case, Samson encounters a lion, and he kills it with his bare hands. Now that's a pretty breathtaking feat. I remember living in Kingston, Jamaica years ago. We had a Jamaican girl living with us who opened a dresser drawer, and there was a big rat, and she killed it with her bare hands, and I was impressed. She grabbed that thing and just choked it. And I thought, Elvira, I hope you don't ever get mad at me. But a lion is a lot bigger than a rat. So, now that in itself is not so bad. I mean, the lion is a living creature. He attacks it and kills it, but it's still a living creature. However, sometime later when he went back, he found bees had built a nest in the carcass of the lion and had created honey, and he ate the honey.
I have a question on him killing that lion.
Sure.
Would he have been considered unclean?
No, he wouldn't, because the lion was alive at the time of the attack. So it's not in the killing of the lion that he defiled himself. It is in going back to the corpse and scooping out the honey. That would have been a serious transgression of his vow. And he just doesn't seem to think that's an issue. So as you go along in the story of Samson, Samson is going to do this in more than one way. And the real threat at this point are the Philistines. Now the Philistines are not an indigenous group in Canaan. They didn't start in Canaan, they started in Crete, and they came from the old Mycenaean Empire in the Aegean Sea. And sometime around the 12th century BC, they started looking for new territory. And they came southward across the Mediterranean in boats, largely, although there were some that actually came by land as well. But they came largely in boats, and they attacked Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses III drove them out of Egypt, and some small groups of the Philistines moved up the coast and settled on the Canaanite coast in what today we call Gaza, the Gaza Strip. Okay? In fact, the word Palestine, we all know that word, that is a derivative of the name Philistine. It goes back to the Roman period, and the Romans called that area Syria Palestina. And we've been pretty much calling it Palestine ever since the days of the Romans. But it goes back to the Philistines themselves. Anyway, they were not among the original Canaanite peoples, but they came there, as I mentioned, about 1185, not long after the Israelites arrived, and settled on the southwest coast in 5 major cities. So they were what the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. And so they invaded and were driven back, and they settled down here. So this is what they look like. If you ever want to know what a Philistine looks like, this Philistine. Maybe not as clear as a photo, but not too bad. This was done by the Egyptians, and the Egyptians have several bas-reliefs of the Philistine Sea Peoples, and they almost always depict them with this kind of headdress that looks like a feathery sort of headgear of some sort. This guy looks especially ominous here. He's got a scowl on his face and so on. Some of them actually, Egyptian depictions show them in boats as they're coming. But anyway, that's kind of a brief picture of what they look like. And they settle down here on this coast in 5 major cities: Ashdod, Ekron, Ashkelon, Gath, and Gaza. And as of today, we have been, over the last several decades, excavating every one of these 5 cities of the Philistines. The one that was sort of the last to be discovered was actually Gath. It was actually identified within, well, the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, it's pretty recent in the excavation. So this is the area, and Samson, of course, is a Danite, so he lives right up in here. This is the area that was allotted to Dan, just north of the Philistines. So he's gone down there, and he's found him a Philistine wife, and there's another part of the story where that didn't work out, and I'll kind of skip that part until eventually he gets fascinated with a woman by the name of Delilah, who agrees to get the secret of his strength from him. And so she starts working on Samson. She sets about questioning him about his superhuman powers, and he tells her a bunch of lies. But every time he lies to her, he gets a little closer to the truth. And in the end, he's going to tell her that his strength lies in his Nazirite vow. If his hair is cut, that's the last symbol of his vow. So she finally manages to get him to sleep, and they cut off his hair, and he gets up to do havoc like he always had every other time because of his great strength, and suddenly he's just like anybody else. So they capture Samson, and they put him to grinding in the mill. This is the last symbol of his vow. So he's then taken to Gaza. They force him to grind in a prison mill. This is what a mill looks like. This is an ancient mill at the spring at Yale in the Gaza Strip. It has a big stone platform, then the big millstone on some kind of a log that goes on a pivot. And so as you work your way, you can see if you just keep going around, it just rolls this thing around. And so grain is put here, and it just keeps crushing grain until it finally turns into a rough sort of flour. So this is now Samson's existence. So his final feat of strength, of course, comes when the Philistines are having a celebration, and they bring him in to make fun of him in their temple. And by this time, what's happened all this time he's been down there grinding away? Hair's been growing. His hair's been growing. If they were smart, they'd have shaved his head before they brought him in, but they didn't. And so they bring him in, and he's guided by this little boy to the pillars that uphold the roof. And he prays one final desperate prayer. Let me die with the Philistines. He pushes down the pillars, and the roof falls in, and he kills more in this last feat of strength than he had killed previously. Now this was in the temple of Dagon. This is Dagon. Dagon is the fish god of the Philistines. This is in the State Museum in Berlin, in Germany. If you ever happen to take a trip to Germany, it would pay you to spend a day, if you have the time, to go to the Pergamon Museum. It's got incredible artifacts. This is one of them. It has also pretty much a reconstruction of the entire Ishtar Gate in Babylon, the gate that was there through which Daniel and the young men passed and the exiles passed and so on. Anyway, this was a fertility deity, and this was the temple in which Samson was brought. We have uncovered a Philistine temple, not in Gaza, but in Tel Qasil, which is not very far away, just a few miles from Gaza. And interestingly enough, when the archaeologists excavated this temple, they discovered there were 2 pillar bases that were 4 pillars to hold up the roof, and those pillars are only about this far apart. Just basically the kind of thing that you have in the book of Judges, where Samson gets between those pillars and he pushes them apart and brings down the roof. In this case, the pillars are about 6 feet apart, so I don't know how big Samson's wingspan was, and maybe they were closer, but anyway, it's the same basic idea. So here's a question. We're going to end up with a couple questions. Do you think Samson looked superhuman, or did he just look ordinary, but because of the power of God was really strong? Did he look like a bodybuilder? You know, all the movies that show Samson, he always looks like, you know, bodybuilder of some sort.
Do they have to do something to make people look at the film?
Well, I suppose, yeah, right.
Sensational journalism.
Yeah, you're right, yeah, okay, I buy that.
Probably developed some muscle with all the grinding
Maybe.
he was doing.
Well, down on the mill, yeah, he may actually did build up some real muscle. I don't know if he had any before, but he might have had afterwards. Although I kind of favor the idea, and I don't have anything to base it on, and this is, if I'm totally wrong, it'll be fine, but I kind of favor the idea that he just looked ordinary, but when the power of God came on him, he was pretty extraordinary. At least that's the way I like to think about it, because I'm pretty ordinary.
I would think that if he didn't look ordinary, there would be some comment about that in the story.
Yeah, you would think there might be the sort of thing that would be mentioned. Yeah, there's different kinds of silences, but some are more significant than others. 2 consecutive stories about vows. Jephthah's vow, Samson's vow. Sometimes I think it may be interesting to think about those two sort of in connection with each other. Jephthah kept his vow somehow. A little bit of mystery about how, but somehow he kept his vow. Samson breaks his vow, and the repercussions out of those kinds of things, the results of those are really interesting things. So I'm going to finish one last question. This is it. Is there a difference between being spirit-empowered and being spiritual? I think there is. And I list as a possible example what Paul says to the Corinthians. He says to them, you come behind in no spiritual gift. You guys are loaded with spiritual gifts, which is like being spirit-empowered. But then about 3 chapters later, he says, I could not speak to you as spiritual, but as worldly. So even though they were spirit-empowered, they weren't very spiritual. And that may be something to keep in mind as a Christian today. There's a lot of people, you see them on television or various places that seem to have a lot of pretty sensational things going on. Maybe some of those are true, maybe they aren't, but that doesn't define them as a spiritual person necessarily.
Even in our own family situations and family units.
Sure, yeah.
There might be those on TV.
I'm going back to the vows
Yeah.
because Jephthah made the vow. Samson's
Parents made his, yeah, that's true.
So he was kind of stuck with that.
Yeah, you're right, he
You know,
was.
so I think he, through his life, he rebelled
Yeah.
against it.
Yeah.
That wasn't something in his heart
Sure.
that he made.
Yeah, and most Nazirite vows were temporary vows for a specified period of time.
He had it their whole.
His was his whole life. In fact, there's only, so far as I know, 2 other people in the Bible who had lifetime spiritual Nazirite vows. And those were Samuel, John the Baptist. Now, Samuel and John the Baptist apparently didn't rebel.